The year is 1959. The final days of February. On the northern slopes of the Ural Mountains, on the side of a desolate peak the locals call Dead Mountain, a frozen tent is discovered. Rescue teams stand motionless in the white emptiness, the wind howling around them, staring in disbelief at the scene before their eyes. The tent fabric has been torn open from the inside. Yes, from the inside. Inside, everything is carefully arranged: boots, coats, a stovepipe, notebooks. But the owners of those belongings are gone. Their boots remain. They do not. Outside, a merciless blizzard drives the snow across the slope. Snow seems to hide every trace, every secret. But no. When you look closely, footprints appear in the snow. Human footprints. Bare feet. They stretch away from the tent in a thin line leading toward the forest, toward the darkness. Not running. Walking. As if a decision had been made and the shelter was abandoned deliberately. 9 young hikers vanished in a single night. There are no signs of struggle, no indication of pursuit. Only a dense silence and a terrifying scene waiting for answers. What happened to those 9 young people? What force on this remote mountainside compelled them to cut through their own tent and flee into the night? We will search for the answers. But what we uncover may raise even more questions. Was it truly nature that claimed their lives? Or does a state secret lurk in the shadows? Let's return to the beginning. The date is January 23rd, 1959. Adventurous students from the Ural Polytechnic Institute set out on a winter expedition. Their leader was Igor Dyatlov, a determined engineering student, 23 years old, and an experienced mountaineer. Around him were 8 others: Zina, Liuda, Rustem, the 2 Yuris, one Krivonishenko, the other Doroshenko. Kolya, whose full name was Nikolai Thibault-Brignol. Sasha, Alexander Kolevatov, and the oldest of the group, Semyon Zolotaryov, 38 years old, who joined at the last moment. These were young people with an athletic spirit, intelligent, capable, full of promise. They had grown up with the Soviet ideal of a sound mind and a sound body, forming a team that did not shrink from hardship. Their goal was clear: to gain experience in extreme winter conditions and to reach the summit of Mount Otorten. With that purpose, they boarded trains and rode in the backs of trucks, heading deep into the heart of the Ural Mountains. On January 27th, the group made their final preparations in the forest settlement of Vizhai. The following day, their trek into the mountains began. But misfortune struck almost immediately. Yuri Yudin, one of the most cheerful members of the group, was forced to turn back due to chronic rheumatism and severe pain in his leg. Reluctantly, Yudin said goodbye to his friends. As he made his way back to the village alone, a deep sadness settled over him. He did not want to continue without them, but his leg would not allow him to go on. Years later, Yuri Yudin would weep as he said, "If I had stayed with them, maybe I could have protected them, or maybe we would have died together." By a cruel twist of fate, Yuri Yudin would become the only survivor. Leaving Yudin behind, the remaining 9 headed north, disappearing into the snowbound mountains. They kept diaries, took photographs. They even created a small travel newspaper, filling it with jokes. "Now we know," they wrote, "the snowman exists, and he lives in the northern Urals." Harmless humor, the kind young people use to say, "We're not afraid of anything." But nature does not always greet humans with a smile. By the end of January, the weather turned harsh. blizzards and sub-zero temperatures disrupted the group's plans. On January 31st, they set up camp near the forest line, intending to tackle the most difficult stretch the following day. On February 1st, 1959, with a snowstorm reducing visibility to almost nothing, they realized they had strayed off their intended route. Instead of reaching the planned pass, they had climbed farther west, onto the slope of Kolatsiakal. They now faced a choice: descend back into the forest and establish a safer camp, or pitch their tent on the exposed slope and spend the night there. The young leader, Dyatlov, did not want to lose the altitude they had gained. Perhaps he even chose deliberately to camp on the wind-swept slope, testing both himself and his team. The snow was waist-deep. That evening, the 9 of them pitched their tent under brutal conditions, tightening the ropes as the storm roared outside. Who knows? Perhaps inside the tent they were still joking. "We'll sleep well tonight," they might have said. "Light the stove and warm up." In their final diary entries, they mentioned the weather and sang songs to lift their spirits. None of them were aware of the disaster that was approaching. And then came the night. The night the mountains seemed to scream. We do not know exactly what sound tore through the darkness or what truly happened. Perhaps a mass of snow cracked above the tent. Perhaps an explosion in the sky burst like thunder, deafening their ears. Or perhaps the ground itself trembled, the mountain groaning beneath them. What we do know is this: around midnight, all 9 hikers woke in terror. In the chaos, several of them rushed toward the tent's exit. But the zipper may have been jammed, crushed by the weight of the snow. There was no time. One of them took a knife and slashed through the tent fabric, then another. They leapt out through the opening. The panic was so overwhelming that no one put on their boots. No one grabbed their heavy coats. Some wore only socks. Some were barefoot. Others wore nothing but thin underclothes as they burst into the snow. Imagine it. Temperatures far below zero. Meters of snow. A pitch-black night. These young people abandoned their tent, their only shelter, and fled into the darkness with almost no equipment at all. Did they flee? Or were they forced to flee? This is where the entire mystery lies. The tracks show that all of them walked in a single line toward the forest. This is not the behavior of a crowd scattering in blind panic. It looks as if they spoke to one another, as if someone said, "Downhill, to the trees, now." Perhaps Dyatlov or Zolotaryov shouted, "An avalanche is coming. Don't go up. Go down." Perhaps they saw a fireball in the sky and decided, "Take cover in the forest." Perhaps a rocket engine exploded near the tent. Perhaps. What we do know is that they left their tent in mortal fear, and that they never returned. Days passed. The group was scheduled to return on February 12th, but they did not come back. At first, this didn't cause serious alarm. Mountaineers were known to run late. But when no word arrived by February 20th, concern turned into fear. Authorities dispatched search teams. Student volunteers, military units, local hunters. Everyone was mobilized. The snow was deep, the weather brutal, yet every effort was made to find the 9 missing hikers. On February 26th, a student from one of the search teams came upon the abandoned tent. Covered in snow, torn on one side, the tent seemed like the silent cry of the missing group. What the searchers found inside was horrifying. Boots, clothing, diaries, all still there. How could these young people have gone outside without their boots in such cold? Experienced mountaineers know exactly what freezing temperatures mean. The footprints made it unmistakably clear. They had walked away on their own feet. There were no signs of a struggle, no unfamiliar tracks nearby. These details would later become the most emphasized elements of the investigation. Whatever had driven them out of that tent, it had to be an irresistible force, powerful enough to make them leave of their own accord. On the second day of the search, traces of a campfire were found beneath a large cedar tree at the edge of the forest, along with the first two bodies. One of the rescuers shouted to the others, "There's someone here!" When the snow was cleared away, the sight that emerged was shocking. Two young men, Yuri Krivonishchenko and Yuri Doroshenko, were lying side by side, dressed only in their underwear, almost completely naked. There was not a single boot or sock on their feet. Their bodies, exposed and smooth beneath the snow, were darkened by the cruelty of -30 degrees. There were partial burn marks on their skin. Half of one man's hair had burned to ash. The other had a 3rd-degree burn on his leg. It looked as though they had come too close to fire. And indeed, right beside them was a small, extinguished campfire. These two young men had clearly gathered branches in desperation and managed to light a fire. But with their bodies so poorly protected, they could not endure for long. They froze to death where they lay. On the trunk of the cedar tree, fresh branches were broken as high as 5 meters up. There were also traces of skin and blood on the bark. This indicated that someone, most likely one of the Yuris, had climbed the tree in the darkness of the night. Perhaps they were trying to see a light on the slope where the tent stood, or perhaps, in blind panic, they climbed upward to escape some unseen danger. Either way, these signs only deepened the strangeness of the event. What was most disturbing was what was found in Krivonishchenko's mouth: a piece of flesh. It became clear that he had bitten and torn it from his own hand. In the final stages of hypothermia, people can experience paradoxical undressing, mistakenly feeling warm and removing their clothes. Perhaps this is why these two had stripped. Or perhaps their clothing had been taken by their companions. Something we will understand later. A few hundred meters uphill from the grim discovery beneath the tree, in the open area between the forest and the tent, 3 more bodies were found. 2 men and 1 woman. They were the group's leader Igor Dyatlov, medical student Zina Kolmogorova, and athlete Rustem Slobodin. All 3 were positioned with their faces turned toward the slope they had climbed, as if trying to return to the camp, to the tent. Dyatlov's hands were clenched against his chest, as though he had been scraping at the snow in his final moments. Zina wore a torn fur coat, and Slobodin had mismatched footwear: a sock on one foot, a felt boot on the other. These 3 were slightly better dressed than the 2 found below, suggesting that after the first pair by the fire had died, their clothing was taken and the others set out once more. A small crack was found in Slobodin's skull, but the doctor did not consider it fatal. It was most likely caused by a fall. The cause of death for all 3 was clear: hypothermia. Their positions seemed to cry out a single truth. They had struggled to return until the very end. Indeed, the investigation records would later state that the 3 perished while attempting to make their way back to the tent. Thus, the lifeless bodies of 5 young people were found in that forest. Finding the remaining 4 took more than 2 additional months. As spring approached and the snow began to melt, a hollow, a depression beneath the snow, was noticed near a stream in early May. Search teams probed the snow with long poles and finally reached the long-awaited painful discovery. The remaining 4 hikers were found together in a snow-covered pit, approximately 4 meters deep. It appeared that these 4, having descended into a more sheltered part of the forest, had attempted to build a snow shelter. However, the ground beneath them lay over a stream. Under the weight of the accumulating snow, the structure collapsed, and they fell into a deep, water-filled ravine. After lying under snow and water for 2 months, the condition of the bodies was horrific. Lyudmila Dubinina's face, for example, was nearly unrecognizable. Her eyes were missing, and her tongue had been torn out completely, down to the root. Beside her, the experienced Zolotaryov was also missing his eyes and had fractures in his skull and ribs. The third body was that of the young Kolevatov, held in the arms of the older instructor Zolotaryov. His neck appeared to be broken, yet externally it was not obvious. He looked as though he had gently fallen asleep. The fourth victim, the intelligent engineering student Kolya Thibault, was in the most severe condition. The back of his skull had been struck by a powerful blow and crushed into fragments. Anyone who witnessed this tragic scene felt a deep chill. How could such severe injuries occur in a snow accident? As the autopsies were conducted one after another, the mystery only deepened. Journalists who read the forensic reports drew attention to the fatal traumas suffered by 3 of the victims. The force that broke these young people's bones exceeds human strength, one expert stated in the report, as if they had been struck by a car. Even more disturbing was this observation. Such powerful impacts had occurred, yet there was not the slightest abrasion on the skin. How was this possible? Indeed, Dubinina and Zolotaryov had broken ribs and internal bleeding severe enough to displace their hearts. Yet externally, there were no bruises, no cuts. It was as though tons of weight had pressed down upon them without even scratching the skin. The only plausible explanation was pressure-based trauma, such as the force generated by an explosion or by intense compression from snow. But if it had been an avalanche, the tent would not have been torn. And those 4 were injured far from the tent, deep in the forest. If it were an explosion, the mountain itself would have been shaken apart. With the evidence available, these fatal injuries remained a complete enigma. Forensic pathologist Vozrojdeny firmly rejected the theory of an attack by the local Mansi people during official questioning, stating, "No human being could inflict these injuries on another person. The strength required is simply beyond human capability." That possibility had been weak from the very beginning. There were no signs of assault or struggle at the campsite or on the bodies. No weapons, no knives. Moreover, the Mansi people were peaceful and had even assisted in the search efforts. So what was this inhuman force? The report offered a vague but telling description: an irresistible force of nature. It was as if, in the manner of a Greek tragedy, a cosmic power beyond human will had claimed the lives of these young people. At this point, another finding emerged. When authorities took samples from the clothing worn by Dubinina and Zolotaryov, they were astonished to discover traces of radiation. Yes, radiation. These garments, contaminated with radioactive isotopes, were emitting levels of radiation far above normal. One expert even noted that despite the bodies having lain in running water for weeks, the measured levels were still high, indicating that the radiation must have been significantly stronger at the outset. This incomprehensible result shocked even those conducting the investigation. The young people who were believed to have died simply from freezing cold also bore the marks of an invisible killer. Radiation. Could it have come from materials they carried, such as thorium-treated gas lamp mantles used in flashlights? Or had something else occurred entirely? The investigative team began to harbor unspoken suspicions. Thoughts turned to state nuclear secrets. At the time, the Soviet military was conducting nuclear warhead tests. Moreover, in 1957, two members of the group, Kolevatov and Krivonishchenko, had been present at the Mayak facility following a major radiation accident. Perhaps their clothing had been contaminated there. However, ordinary forensic investigators had no power to clarify such a strategically sensitive matter. And indeed, the moment the radioactivity report entered the case file, the course of the investigation changed abruptly. In May 1959, the prosecutor's office abruptly closed the investigation. The official reasoning contained exactly these words: the deaths of the group members were caused by a natural force over which they had no control. That was all. No avalanche was mentioned. No further explanation was given. There were no responsible parties. No guilty ones. The incident was pushed into history as a tragic accident. The case file was stamped, classified, and transferred to the state archives. The families of the deceased were given no clear explanation of what had happened. Parents who had lost 9 sons and daughters were not satisfied with this conclusion. Many submitted petitions and letters demanding a more thorough investigation. According to some accounts, a few even attempted to reach the Soviet leader Khrushchev himself. But Soviet bureaucracy was like a wall of lead. No further answers were given. When the bodies were returned to their families, those who attended the funerals began to speak of something strange. The skin of the deceased appeared unusually darkened. In reality, this was the effect of prolonged exposure to extreme cold after death. But no one could be certain at the time. One child present at the funeral, Yuri Kuntsevich, whom we mentioned earlier, would later recall. They all looked as if their skin had been bronzed and their hair had turned gray. These accounts planted a troubling question in people's minds. Had something nuclear occurred? Official authorities, however, closed the door completely on such discussions. The state remained silent, but the people began to speak. Everyone had heard something. Orange lights were seen in the sky. There was radiation on the bodies. Their tongues were cut out. Some whispered that none of this could possibly be explained by a simple avalanche. Others insisted. The military must have tested something by mistake, and they became the victims. The Soviet press, however, treated the incident with only brief single-column reports. No details were provided, and no speculation was permitted. The case was pushed behind the cold curtain of state censorship. Yet the rumors did not disappear. They continued to live on underground. 30 years passed. By the time the calendar reached the 1990s, the Soviet Union was entering a period of dissolution. With the policy of glasnost, openness, old secrets began to surface one by one. The Dyatlov Pass tragedy resurfaced as a cold case, brought back into focus by curious researchers. In 1990, a journalist named Anatoly Gushchin published a book titled The Price of State Secrets, 9 lives. In it, Gushchin suggested, not openly, but by implication, that a secret Soviet weapons test may have been responsible for the deaths of the hikers. The book attracted enormous public interest and sold rapidly. This renewed attention emboldened Lev Ivanov, the deputy prosecutor who had led the original investigation in 1959. In an interview given after his retirement, Ivanov stated plainly, "I will speak honestly. At the time, we could not find a logical explanation." He went further still, revealing a cover-up. Reports stating that terrifying fireballs had been seen were removed under pressure from my superiors. Ivanov also shared a possibility he had considered at the time. According to him, perhaps energy-emitting spheres that we could not identify were responsible for the deaths, an implication that pointed unmistakably toward UFOs. These sensational statements thrust the Dyatlov case back into the national spotlight. Newspapers that had once been unable to stray from the official line now ran headlines such as "Massacre by Fireballs." The Soviet Union was gone. Censorship had collapsed. People were finally free to write and speak openly. After the 1990s, the Dyatlov case turned into a true legend. Documentaries, television programs, and international news reports followed one another. In Russia, a foundation was established in Dyatlov's name, and commemorative tours to the site were organized. At the same time, researchers began proposing countless theories. Some claimed the killers were CIA agents who met with infiltrated KGB operatives and the operation went wrong. Others insisted Yetis attacked them. The situation sometimes took on an almost absurd tone. The Discovery Channel even took a joking diary entry in which the group mentioned the Yeti and turned it into a semi-fictional documentary titled Russia's Snowman Killer. It may have seemed ridiculous at times, but there were serious developments as well. In 2019, exactly 60 years after the incident, the Russian Prosecutor General's office reopened the case. This new investigation was strictly limited in scope. Only natural causes would be examined. A team traveled to Dyatlov Pass in the middle of winter and recalculated the terrain, the slope, the weather conditions, and other factors. The result? In July 2020, it was announced at an official press conference. The Dyatlov group had died in an avalanche. At last, the state spoke clearly, and spoke only of nature. To support this conclusion, mathematical models and simulations were presented. A study published by Swiss scientists in the journal Communications, Earth and Environment also supported the small-scale avalanche scenario. One detail from that study caught public attention. The snow simulation algorithms used in the animated film Frozen had inspired the scientists in modeling avalanche dynamics. In other words, even Walt Disney had, indirectly, contributed to solving the Dyatlov mystery. But, the fact that everything now appears to have a rational explanation does not mean it will fade from memory. The Dyatlov case has occupied the minds of millions for decades. And although the official conclusion points to an avalanche, many people remain unsatisfied with that answer. To them, the explanation offered 60 years later by the Soviet state amounts to little more than an attempt at self-exoneration. Perhaps we will never know the truth. Sometimes the truth remains hidden, whispered only by the wind sweeping across the mountain's ridge. What we know for certain is this: 9 young people lost their lives in the cold of the Ural Mountains. They left behind unfinished dreams, grieving families and questions without answers. Some parents passed away without ever learning how or why their sons or daughters died. After all these years, what remains is a single, enduring enigma. Whether the truth will ever fully emerge is unknown. But the spirit of Dyatlov Pass lives on, in the wind that sweeps across the mountain slopes every winter. And each time that wind blows, it whispers the same question. Were they truly killed by nature or by human hands?